You know what happens to truths that come too soon. They are not welcome. They are not debated. They are being fought, not because they are false, but precisely because they are true, and that this truth disturbs an established order, a hierarchy, a collective certainty, a fragile balance that some have an interest in preserving. Human history is not a slow, triumphant march towards the light. It is a succession of resistances, a constant struggle between what is discovered and what can be accepted. Look, Galileo observes the sky. He points his telescope towards Jupiter. He sees his moons turning. He understands that the Earth is not the motionless center of the universe. He's not inventing anything. They observe. What does the most powerful institution of its time do? She does not dispute the observation. She does not check the calculations. She orders him to be quiet. He is forced to retract his statement. He is made to recant publicly. He ended his life under house arrest, his books banned, his name associated with heresy. The Earth will continue to rotate, however, without asking his permission. A few centuries later, Charles Darwin spent over 20 years accumulating evidence, fossils, variations, patient observations. When he finally publishes, he does not receive an honest scientific debate. He is caricatured as a monkey, accused of destroying human dignity, presented as a moral danger. Yet he only did one thing, to describe what nature showed. Then there is Ignaz Semmelweis, a doctor, a simple man, a scandalous idea for its time. Wash your hands before giving birth. The numbers speak for themselves. Mortality is falling. Thousands of lives are saved. But his colleagues feel humiliated. Their authority was threatened, implicitly accused of causing deaths. They do not refute his results. They insult him. They isolate him. They lock him up. Semmelweis dies beaten in an asylum. Today, every surgeon washes their hands, and nobody says his name. Do you see the diagram? He's still the same. A disturbing truth emerges. An institution feels threatened. She attacks the messenger. It discredits. She silences him. Then comes silence. Years, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries. And finally, when no one feels threatened anymore, rehabilitation is coming. When the discoverer died, when his truth no longer bothers anyone. You have lived long enough to have observed this mechanism, perhaps in your profession, perhaps in your family, perhaps in the major debates of your time. This is the way institutions react when someone touches something sacred. But here is the question that history rarely asks aloud. What if this mechanism wasn't only relevant to science? What if it didn't stop at laboratories and observatories? And if it also affected to the sacred itself? Because there is one area where the resistance is even more violent, more emotional, more dangerous: religion. To touch upon the origin of a faith, it is not simply a matter of correcting a factual error. It's an attack on identity, to childhood, to the family, to that which gives meaning to the lives of millions of people. So, for a very long time, a tacit rule existed. We do not apply the same critical tools to living religions as to other areas of history, especially not to some. And yet, 1977, University of Oxford. Two young historians publish a book, not a pamphlet, not an ideological diatribe, an academic book, 268 pages, published by Cambridge University Press, one of the most respected publishing houses in the world. Their approach is simple, almost naive. Applying this to the history of the origins of Islam, exactly the same method that has been used for decades for early Christianity ancient Judaism, ancient Rome. Not a plus, no less. Ignore the later accounts. Set aside traditions compiled centuries after the events. Focus solely on what actually existed at the time: the registrations, the coins, contemporary manuscripts, direct testimonies, documents that cannot be rewritten afterwards, traces that don't lie. What they discover does not correspond to the official story. No way. What happens next is sadly predictable. Accusations, pressures, silence imposed. But what I am about to show you here is not based on rumors, nor on modern speculations, nor on gratuitous provocations. These are authentic historical documents, published sources, verifiable evidence. These are works that have been discussed, but never refuted, in the academic world. If you're still here, it means you're one of those who prefer to understand rather than repeat. Subscribe. This survey is for those who embrace complexity, because what this story reveals does not simply call into question a text. She questions the power who froze it. Before going any further, the scene needs to be clearly set. We need to understand what everyone believes, something billions of people have learned since childhood. What we repeat, what we recite, what we never question. The official account of the birth of Islam is well known, simple, powerful, consistent. According to this account, it all began at the start of the 7th century in Arabia, in a cave, on a mountain. A man named Muhammad receives a direct revelation from God, not a vague inspiration, not a hunch. A divine word, exact, perfect, eternal. This revelation is transmitted orally, then put into writing, word for word, without alteration, without omission, no additions. The Quran is not a human text. It is the very word of God, descended to earth, preserved intact for 14 centuries. No verses were lost, no changes, no significant human intervention. The book we read today would be exactly the same than that recited by the prophet himself. That is the heart of the story, a perfect revelation, an unchanging text, a faithful transmission. And this story is not simply a theological element. It is the central pillar of Muslim identity. Because if the Quran is the direct word of God, then to question it historically, this is not about debating an old document. This strikes at the very foundation of faith, to prayer, according to the law, to morality, in the sense of life. Understand clearly what this implies. In Islam, the Quran is not inspired by God. It is God who speaks. Therefore, by definition, there is no room for error, no room for evolution, no room for rewriting. And that is precisely why that this story is considered untouchable, not only by believers, but also by a large part of the academic world. For a very long time, an implicit rule prevailed. We can study the history of Islam, provided that the original text is never altered. We can analyze the conquests, the dynasties, case law, the later theological debates. But what about the Quran itself? In formation? In the transmission? Its possible older variants? Silence. Not because the question would be absurd, but because it's explosive. Because to ask the question is already to transgress it. Imagine for a moment a historian publicly stating that the Quran might have a human history, a compilation, choices, deletions. Even today, in some Western universities, that's enough to ruin a career. So for decades, many preferred to look away. Not out of individual cowardice, but out of institutional prudence, because the stakes are enormous, because the line between historical research and perceived offense is fragile. Because tampering with the sacred always involves taking a risk. It's simpler to repeat the official narrative, to say, the Quran has been preserved, and to move on to something else. But the story, the real one, doesn't like restricted areas. And sometimes, it's precisely these areas which conceal the most interesting questions. Because here's the crucial point. No serious historian today would dare to assert that the Gospels were written by direct witnesses. No scholar argues that the Torah was written by Moses. These texts are studied, compared, and contextualized. Their religious sacredness does not preclude historical analysis. Why would it be any different for Islam? Why apply two different methods? According to the religion being studied? Very few have dared to ask this question openly, and those who did it have often paid the price. But before we get to that point, let me be perfectly clear. What we are examining here is not an attack on faith. It is possible, profoundly possible, to respect a religious tradition while acknowledging that his story is complex. It is possible to love a foundational narrative without confusing it with a literal historical account. It is even a sign of mature faith. Or, for those who do not believe, of an honest historical intelligence, because it's a tradition that refuses any questioning is not strong. It is fragile. And this is where the first doubt arises. One detail, a seemingly tiny detail, a detail that goes unnoticed as long as we don't look at the sources closely. But once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. This detail does not ruin the story. He does not deny it. He cracks it. And this crack raises a question which is deeply disturbing. What if this story wasn't false, but incomplete? To understand what follows, we need to change our approach. We need, for a moment, to set aside what we think we know and adopt a cold, patient, sometimes uncomfortable gaze from the historian, not that of the believer, not that of the activist, the investigators. In the 1970s, some researchers are beginning to ask themselves a question of an almost disturbing simplicity. What if we studied the origins of Islam in exactly the same way that we study all other periods of human history, nor with hostility, not with reverence, methodically? Among them, two names will play a central role. Not polemicists, not media provocateurs, academics, trained in the best institutions, specialists in ancient languages, accustomed to working with difficult, fragmentary, ambiguous sources. Their intention is not to shock, even less so to destroy a faith. They simply want to answer an honest question. What do contemporary documents actually say about the beginnings of Islam? And this is where their method becomes disturbing, because it rests on a fundamental principle of critical history. The closer a source is to the events it describes, the more precious it is. Conversely, the later a source is, plus it must be handled with care. For what? Because memory changes, because the stories become more embellished, because political issues rewrite the past. This is true for all civilizations, without exception. So, what are these researchers doing? They start by setting aside everything that was written very late. Biographies of the Prophet written more than a century after his death. The traditions were compiled several generations later. The stories were already fixed within a theological framework, not because they would be useless, but because they cannot be used alone as primary historical evidence. Instead, they focus on four types of sources. First of all, Contemporary sources. Chronicles written by eyewitnesses. Monks, administrators, travelers, Byzantine, Syriac, Armenian scribes, people who lived at that time, who saw these new Arab conquerors coming, who described what they observed without knowing that they were writing for history. Afterwards, the registrations, words engraved in stone, on buildings, on terminals, on rocks in the middle of the desert, short texts, envelopes, impossible to change afterwards. Then, numismatics, the coins, often overlooked by the general public, but crucial for the historian. Because a single room says a lot. Who governs? What language is being used? Which symbols are considered legitimate? What ideology is being promoted? And finally, dated manuscripts, not medieval copies, not oral traditions that were fixed late in the game. Ancient fragments, carbon-14 dated, analyzed paleographically, compared line by line, imperfect documents, sometimes damaged, but authentic. And it is by cross-referencing all these sources that the investigation truly begins. But here's the thing. From the initial analyses, something doesn't add up. This document poses a major problem. Contemporary sources, those of the 7th century, they do not tell the story as we know it today. They are indeed talking about Arab conquests, of battles, of captured cities, but they don't clearly speak of a new religion called Islam. They do not refer to a sacred book already circulating in a fixed form. They use other terms, other categories, sometimes blurry, sometimes surprising. And this is not an isolated source. There are several of them, independent of each other. So the researchers are checking. They overlap. They doubt their own interpretation. They say to themselves, perhaps we misunderstood. They return to the registration area, and here again, an oddity. The first Arabic inscriptions, they mention God. They speak of blessings. They profess monotheism, but they do not clearly mention a canonized Quran, nor a central prophet as we know him today. Then come the coins. Some still bear Byzantine symbols, crosses, inscriptions in Greek, as if the religious identity of power was still in transition, as if everything wasn't settled yet. Then the manuscripts, ancient fragments, in palimpsests, texts rewritten based on other texts, variations, differences, visible corrections. Nothing scandalous for a historian, but something profoundly incompatible with the idea of a text perfectly fixed from the outset. At this stage, the researchers have not reached a conclusion. They are not making any public statements. They observe. They note one essential thing: the silence of ancient springs where the official narrative asserts absolute clarity. And this silence is noisy. Because in history, absence is sometimes as revealing as presence. When a major event is supposed to have occurred, when a foundational text is supposed to circulate, and that contemporary witnesses do not speak of it, that alone proves nothing. But this forces us to ask a question, an uncomfortable question. And if what we call today the origins of Islam had been much more gradual, much more humane, much more complex than what the official narrative suggests? At this stage, we do not yet have a definitive answer. Only clues, anomalies, inconsistencies. But one thing is already certain. The ground is not as stable as we were told, and that's just the first anomaly. At this stage of the investigation, something is starting to weigh on me. Not an isolated case, not a unique anomaly that could be easily explained, but an accumulation. Because the more researchers advance, the more inconsistencies pile up, calmly, methodically, relentlessly. Let's start with a simple fact, almost commonplace. If the Quran, as we know it today, already existed in a canonical form from the mid-7th century, then it should leave clear traces, explicit references, quotes, undeniable credentials. However, in the oldest sources, these references are surprisingly absent. Contemporary chroniclers speak of Arabs, of conquerors, monotheists, but they are not talking about a specific sacred book already circulating as a central religious authority. They don't say they follow the Quran. They do not quote any verses. They do not mention a fixed text. It's a strange silence, especially when you compare it to the absolute importance that this book would later have. But here's the thing. When the first handwritten fragments appear, they, in turn, pose a problem. Not because they would be false, but because they are not identical. Variations, differences in wording, words added, others were absent, sometimes minimal, sometimes more significant. Nothing extraordinary for the historian. All ancient texts mention this, but deeply disturbing if we start from the principle that the text was already perfectly finalized. Some manuscripts show visible corrections, erased lines, words rewritten over others, palimpsests, recycled texts, reused, modified. And these changes did not date back to the Middle Ages. They are old, very old. So the researchers are asking themselves a simple question. If the text was already untouchable, who corrects it? And why? But that's not all. There are also the silences. Entire periods where one would expect to find clear references, and where there is nothing. No written theological debates. No controversies over specific verses. No discussions on a law that has been definitively revealed. As if, for a time, the text was not yet in the center. As if religious practice existed before the canonized book. And this is where the discrepancy becomes striking. Because when we observe ancient religious practices, they do not always correspond to what the later official text prescribes. The direction of prayer, certain ritual formulas, certain legal uses. They seem to be evolving, changer, settling in gradually, as if practice preceded the written standard and not the other way around. But here's the thing. In the official narrative, the text comes first. The practice stems from this. In ancient sources, it's often the opposite. The practice exists, then it is justified, codified, sacred. This discrepancy is not insignificant. He suggests a process, a building, an evolution over time, not a single, instantaneous, definitive event. Even more disturbing, some verses seem to answer to specific political situations, conflicts, rivalries, a need for authority, as if the text were in dialogue with history instead of overlooking it, as if certain formulations were adapted to a given context. But in this case, who is writing this? When? And to answer what? With each new layer of evidence, the unease is growing, because each element, taken in isolation, could be explained. A variation here, a silence there, a different practice elsewhere, but all together, they are drawing a picture, a painting where the sacred text does not appear as a block that fell from the sky, but like a living body, entraining, stabilizing. And the clearer this picture becomes, plus something else becomes visible. Institutional silence. This data is not new. They have existed for a long time. They are published, available for consultation, but they are rarely put together, rarely told as a coherent story. For what? Because assembling them, it's crossing an invisible line. This suggests that something essential, it was built over time. And that deeply disturbs. So we isolate the anomalies. We neutralize them. They are relegated to footnotes. We especially avoid to ask the overall question. But at this stage of the investigation, the researchers no longer have a choice. Because when too many contradictions accumulate, doubt becomes reasonable, and the silence becomes suspicious. So, one question inevitably arises. At this precise point in the investigation, one thing is starting to become clear. The inconsistencies are not random. The silences are not accidental. The variations are not isolated copyist errors. They follow a logic. And this logic is not theological. It is political. Because when a text suddenly stabilizes, when a version is necessary, when the alternatives disappear, we need to ask ourselves a simple question. Who had the power to decide? And this is where a man enters the scene. A leader, a strategist, an empire builder, a name rarely mentioned in spiritual narratives, but central in the historical archives. We are at the end of the 7th century. The Islamic world is young, fragile, unstable. The conquests were swift and decisive, too fast perhaps. Vast territories have fallen under Arab domination in just a few decades, but conquering is not governing. The populations are diverse: Christians, Jewish women, Zoroastrians, pagans. Languages are mixing. The laws differ. Religious practices are not uniform. And above all, central power is being challenged. Civil wars break out. Clans are clashing. There are competing interpretations circulating. Authority is threatened from within. It is in this explosive context that a leader comes to power. A man who understands one essential thing. An empire cannot survive without unity, not just military, not just administrative, ideological. He understands that a shared narrative is needed, a reference text, an official version, not to enlighten consciences, but to stabilize power. And that's where everything changes, because from that moment on, the text is no longer just transmitted. He is selected, organized, fixed. This executive is launching an ambitious venture. Gather what is circulating, compare the versions, discard what diverges, preserve what unites us. Variants become a problem. Differences are a threat. Alternative readings, a political danger. Because as long as several versions coexist, the authority remains questionable. But a unique version, sacred, untouchable, this is a tool of absolute power. Then begins a discrete process, but decisive. Text standardization. Oral traditions are filtered. The written fragments are compared. The differences have been resolved, not through public debate, not by popular consensus, by central decision. The line corresponding to the chosen line is retained. The problem disappears. Not always through visible destruction, but through non-transmission, through deliberate oversight, through imposed silence. Divergent copies are eliminated. Marginalized alternative readings. The competing versions were declared incorrect. Gradually, only one form of the text is acceptable. And this form is not presented like a human decision. It is presented as eternal, as if it had always existed that way, as if she had never been anything else. That is what sacralization is. Transforming a historic's choice truly timeless. Transform a version in absolute revelation. From there, any divergence becomes heresy. Any question becomes blasphemy. Any variation becomes a threat. And the process is remarkably effective, Because once the text is sacralized, it is no longer possible to discuss its origin without challenging the established order. But look closely. This process is not unique. It's not exceptional. It existed elsewhere, in other times, in other forms. Christian councils did the same thing. They chose which gospels to keep, which ones to exclude, what doctrine should be imposed. The Jewish texts have been fixed in specific political contexts, particularly during exile. Wherever power seeks to endure, it freezes a narrative. This 7th century leader, he invented nothing. He applied a proven logic. But what makes his action so decisive? That's his timing. Because the text was not yet completely finalized. Practices were not uniform. The interpretations remained open. There were alternatives, different ways of understanding the message, competing interpretations, traditions that could have evolved differently. But once the official version was imposed, these alternatives become invisible, not because they were false, but because they were no longer useful to those in power. And that's when we finally understand the meaning of the silences observed earlier. Why are some periods silent? Why some variants have left no trace? Why ancient manuscripts show corrections? Because a sorting process took place, a political sorting, an ideological sorting, a strategic sorting. And this sorting has shaped what billions of people today, they consider it immutable. Please understand this point clearly. Saying that does not mean that the text is worthless, nor that it is devoid of spiritual meaning. This simply means that it has a story, a human story, complex, conflictualized, and this story has been locked away at a specific moment by a specific man in a specific context. From there, the official narrative prevails. Everything that precedes it is reinterpreted through it. Anything that contradicts it is erased. And what remains becomes the truth, but a stabilized truth by power. And that's why that some questions remain taboo, because they don't just threaten a belief, they threaten the very structure upon which this belief was consolidated. And now that this mechanism is visible, one last thing becomes clear. What was removed was not a mistake. This was not an insignificant detail. It was an alternative. At this stage, all the pieces are on the table. Nothing is more isolated. Nothing is accidental. The silences, the variations, the corrections, political decisions, everything fits together. What we are observing now, it is no longer a series of anomalies, but a process, a known process, documented elsewhere, repeated throughout history. Canonization, a technical term, almost neutral, but the consequences are immense. Canonizing is not just about collecting texts. That's it. Decide. It's a choice. That's excluding it. That is to say, this is true. This is not the case. And most importantly, this will be passed on. This will be forgotten. Take a good look at this mechanism, because it changes absolutely everything. Initially, there was no book. There are words, recitations, fragments, multiple oral traditions. Some of them overlap. Others disagree. Some are local. Others circulate more widely. That's normal. It's human nature. All religious traditions begin this way. But there comes a time where this plurality becomes a problem. When an empire is formed, when authority needs to be centralized, when the law must be uniform. So, a decision must be made. Which texts should be kept? Which stories should be prioritized? Which wording should be used? And above all, which ones to eliminate? Because eliminating does not always mean burning. Most often, this simply means no more copying, to stop teaching, Do not quote again. Silence is the most effective weapon. This is how selection works. Fragments compatible with the dominant ideology are integrated. Those who cause problems are marginalized. But what problems exactly? Political problems. Because some verses, certain older formulations, open up dangerous interpretations. Interpretations where authority is not centralized, where power is not sacrosanct, where the community takes precedence over the state. Ambiguous wording. Stories that are too open-ended. Messages that are too universal. Look closely at this verse, or rather, this type of verse. Those that leave room for doubt, open to discussion, to the interpretation. In a context of conquest and civil war, this kind of ambiguity is a weakness. Power needs clarity, of rigidity, clear rules. Then the text is adjusted, not necessarily invented, but biased. Passages that reinforce obedience are highlighted. Those who question authority are relegated. Those who could legitimize opposition are neutralized. And little by little, a coherence emerges. A coherence that is not only theological, but political. This detail changes absolutely everything. Because that means the final text is not simply the reflection of a revelation, but the product of a context. From a specific moment in history, from a specific need for power. And if that seems shocking to you, look elsewhere. Christianity went through exactly the same process. During the first few centuries, dozens of gospels were circulating. Some spoke of a mystical Jesus. Others see a political Jesus. Others are from a teacher of inner wisdom. Then came the councils. Men gather. They are debating. They vote. They decide which texts are inspired and which ones are apocryphal. The Gospels of Thomas, Mary, Peter disappear, not because they were wrong in the modern sense, but because they were not useful to the structure of the imperial church. The same applies to the Torah. Historians now know that it has been compiled and fixed after the Babylonian exile, in a context of identity crisis, loss of territory, a need for cohesion. Ancient traditions have been gathered together. Others were ruled out. A national narrative has been constructed. No one is offended by it today. It is taught, accepted, documented. Why would it be any different here? Why imagine that Islam would have escaped this universal mechanism who always links the sacred to power? The answer is simple. Because recognizing this process amounts to recognizing that the text has a human story. And that profoundly changes the way we perceive it. Because a text that has a history can be questioned, contextualized, compared, while a text presented as eternal can only be obeyed. That's the whole difference. And that's why that canonization is never neutral. She transforms a living message in a fixed standard. It transforms a pluralistic tradition truly unique. She transforms the sacred as a tool of the state. From that moment on, the text is no longer used solely for prayer. It is used to govern. It legitimizes the decisions. He justifies the laws. It demands obedience. And any questioning becomes an attack against the established order. That's why some variants have disappeared. That is why some fragments were never transmitted. That is why ancient manuscripts show corrections. It's not chaos. It's the organization. That's not the mistake. This is the selection. In this process, it was incredibly effective. In a few generations, a single version is necessary. It is taught, recited, memorized. It becomes the only possible one. Everything that precedes it is reread through it. Anything that contradicts it is forgotten. And after a few centuries, No one remembers anymore that there was a choice. The official version becomes the only one imaginable. But history, when you look at it closely, always leaves traces, cracks, inconsistencies, recalcitrant manuscripts. And it is these traces that some researchers have dared to follow, not to destroy a faith, but to understand a mechanism. Understanding how men, in a context of war, power struggles, and imperial construction, have shaped a text which would go on to structure entire civilizations. And that's precisely why that their work has disturbed. Because he wasn't attacking a belief, but to the authority who used it. Because once you see this mechanism, you can no longer ignore it. You understand that the sacred has always been linked to politics. The founding texts are also tools for cohesion, control, of legitimation, and those who dare to say this out loud are never welcomed with kindness. They are too disruptive. They remind us that behind the proclaimed eternity, decisions have been made, choices, exclusions, and those who dared to say it paid the price. Once you understand that, the investigation ceases to be abstract. She becomes human. Because behind every disturbing truth, there are always men and women who dared to formulate it. And almost always, they paid the price. Let's go back a moment. You remember Galileo, the Darwin, the Semmelweis. You remember the diagram, a discovery, an institution under threat, a violent reaction, then silence. This mechanism did not stop in the 17th century. He did not limit himself to the natural sciences. He continues, even today, simply in more subtle forms, more sophisticated, more respectable in appearance. Because when it comes to religion, books are no longer burned publicly. Researchers are no longer thrown in prison. We can do better. We isolate them. They are discredited. They are confined to an academic silence. Researchers who dared to examine the origins of sacred texts with the tools of critical history did not become celebrities. They are not invited onto the sets. Their work is not popularized. They are rarely taught. They exist, but in the margins. Some have seen their careers come to a sudden halt. Others have been accused of ideological motivations. Others have had their words distorted, caricatured, and simplified to the extreme. Their evidence is not in dispute. We are attacking their intentions. It's always the same strategy. Because debating the facts, that would mean accepting the realm of reason. So the debate shifts towards morality. Why are they doing this? What are they really looking for? Who do they serve? It doesn't matter what they have demonstrated. The key is to sow doubt about their integrity. And very quickly, the message is clear to everyone else. Don't touch that, or you will be next. So many remain silent, or they censor themselves, or they choose less sensitive topics, not because they have nothing to say, but because they understood the price to pay. And this silence continues. It lasts because the stakes are so high. Because recognizing that sacred texts have a human history, it is accepting that religious authority rests partly based on old political decisions. It is to acknowledge that power has shaped the sacred. And that, no institution likes to hear it, especially in a world where religion remains intimately linked to identity, to geopolitics, to contemporary conflicts. Asking these questions today, it's not just about making history. This touches on fault lines that are still active. So we prefer to say that this research is marginal, controversial, useless, even when they are well documented. But history teaches us one essential thing. This silence is never eternal. It is temporary. You have lived long enough to recognize this mechanism. You saw him in action in scientific debates, in political affairs, in institutional revelations. At first, we deny it. Next, we attack. Then we fall silent. And one day, years later, the truth is coming to light, calmly, without triumph. When those who wore it are no longer there to take advantage of it. Galileo never saw his rehabilitation. Semmelweis non plus. And many contemporary researchers who open these avenues will probably never see their work fully recognized during their lifetime. But their work remains. Published. Archives. Available for consultation. They are waiting. Because history has this strange property. It always ends up catching up with the official narratives. Not for ideological reasons. Not out of activism. Through an accumulation of facts. And the more time passes, the more difficult it becomes to maintain certain restricted areas. Because the manuscripts are there, the registration forms are here, the coins are there. They don't scream, they do not provoke, they exist. And that's precisely why that they are so dangerous. Because they cannot be accused of intent. They are mute, but eloquent. So why does this silence persist to this day? Because questioning a foundational narrative is never insignificant. Because religious institutions are not merely spiritual structures. They are also social structures, politics, symbolic. They organize the world. They provide reference points. They provide meaning. And touch upon their historical foundation may give the impression to weaken everything. So we often prefer to know nothing, or pretend to be. But there comes a time where knowledge becomes too burdensome to ignore, where the accumulation of evidence makes the silence unbearable. And that's where we are today, at a tipping point, not yet visible to the general public, but it's already very clear to those who look closely. What this investigation has shown so far, this is not an attack against the faith. It sheds light on a universal mechanism, a mechanism you recognize because you've seen it elsewhere, a mechanism where power shapes the narrative. Then he sanctifies the story. Then she shields him from any questions. And those who dare to question are sidelined. It's human nature. It's old. It's repetitive. The real question now is no longer to know if this mechanism exists. You saw it. The real question then becomes, but what to do with this knowledge? Arrived here. Something has changed. Not just in what you know, but in the way you look at the stories. Because this story is not just about an ancient text. She's talking about us, our relationship to power, to identity, to the deep need to believe that certain things escape history. What this investigation reveals above all, it is a universal mechanism. Power always seeks to legitimize itself, to become natural, obvious, untouchable. And for that, he needs stories, foundational narratives, stories that explain why the existing order is not only practical, but fair, necessary, almost sacred. When a power succeeds in establishing its authority in a sacred text, he has crossed a decisive threshold. It no longer governs only bodies. It governs consciences. But be careful. This does not mean that believers are naive, nor that faith is an illusion. This means that human faith is always part of a human story. We need stories to understand the world, to endure injustice, to give meaning to suffering, to transmit values. It's profoundly human, and that's precisely why that stories are so powerful. They unite, they offer comfort, they provide structure, but they can also be fixed, exploited, protected from any questions. What this story teaches us, it's because it's possible to do two things at once: to respect a tradition and to acknowledge that its origin is complex, to love a foundational narrative, and to accept that it was shaped by men in a specific context. Believe without giving up on understanding, because respect for faith does not require historical naivety. On the contrary, a faith that brooks no questions is a fragile faith. A tradition that forbids any investigation is a tradition that doubts itself. Intellectual maturity begins there, in the ability to say, "This story is precious. It has served generations, but he is not outside of time," in the ability to accept that the sacred has a history. In this maturity, you recognize her, because you belong to a generation who has seen too many certainties crumble to still believe in truths that are too simple. You have lived long enough to understand that the world is more nuanced than what we were taught. You know that institutions sometimes lie, that official accounts are often incomplete, that reality is almost always more complex. And yet, you continue to search for meaning, not a imposed direction, but a meaning understood. That is the true legacy, not to transmit rigid dogmas, but to transmit a method, the ability to examine, compare, to doubt without cynicism, the ability to tell those who come after you, love's traditions, but don't be afraid to look them in the face. Because understanding how a text was shaped does not render it meaningless. That makes him human. And there is something profoundly admirable in this humanity. Men and women, in a context of chaos, of wars, power struggles, have created some pretty powerful narratives to span 14 centuries. They forged identities, civilizations, crops. This is not fraud. It's a human achievement, but a human feat, not a timeless miracle. Recognize this. It does not destroy the sacred. This puts him back in his rightful place. In history, among men, with their fears, their hopes, their ambitions, and perhaps the greatest form of respect that one might have for a tradition, it's not about freezing it, but to understand it. Because what we have seen here is not only about Islam. This applies to all large human structures, religions, the nations, ideologies. They all originate from a story. They all protect themselves from being questioned. They all aspire to eternity. And yet, they all have a story. This knowledge does not make you cynical. It makes you clear-headed. And lucidity, this may be the only form of wisdom that can be passed on sustainably. You cannot control what future generations will believe, but you can pass it on to them tools for thinking. The ability to recognize the power mechanisms behind the narratives. Faith must be distinguished from its instrumentalization. To love without being blind. That is the most precious legacy. Not reassuring certainties that confine, but an open intelligence that liberates. And if this survey resonated with you, if you feel that these complex truths deserve to exist, so subscribe. Because lucidity also needs an audience. Truth doesn't fall from the sky. It is built here below. And now, you know that.